Perfect. So we're going to be talking about leadership, in particular, how to start to develop this coaching approach to leadership. So in terms of what you would like to do or what you'd like to get from today, I'd love to hear what's one thing that you would like to get from this session today. There's stuff, obviously there's content I'm going to cover, but I'd love to hear if there's one thing that you've joined today, if there's one thing that is on your mind or is something that you're thinking, yeah, I'd really like to explore a specific element of coaching or a specific element of leadership. Just put a note in the chat box, because I'll aim to cover that as part of today's session. It may already be on the agenda, but if it isn't, I'll make sure that we cover that as part of today's session. So Joe, thank you. Joe says, want to say thanks, Justin, about previous stuff about difficult conversations, as I've just had one. And because of what you taught me, it was very positive. Thanks, Joe. And congratulations. I'm really pleased to hear you're tackling some of those more difficult conversations head on. They're not easy situations to navigate through or to kind of muster up the courage to face, but it's really important. When you do it, it's surprising how effective it is. It works for you, and interestingly, it normally is beneficial for the other person. Even though it's a difficult conversation, it's normally beneficial for both you and them. So thanks, Joe. I'm really pleased that you've had that experience based on our previous workshops as well. So feel free to drop in there if there's one thing that you want to get from today's session. Feel free to drop it in there. I'll keep an eye on the waiting room, just to make sure that if we do get anybody joining us late, I'll just make sure that I'm getting that letting them in, because I'm known for leaving people hanging in the waiting room. Eleanor, thanks, Eleanor. Eleanor says, hello, I'm really interested in effective coaching conversations. This is a large part of my job, and although enjoyable, it can be difficult trying to redirect anyone with a fixed mindset. Thank you. Okay, yes, thanks, Eleanor. You're absolutely right. That fixed mindset is quite challenging. I've coached and worked with, managed and worked alongside lots of people that would sit in that category, and it's not always easy. So we will talk about some ways in which we can tackle that. Thanks, Eleanor. That's great. Okay, let me start today's session then. So let me share my slides so that you can see what I can see. There we go. And today's session really is an opportunity, as I normally say at the start of these sessions, because it's really useful. It's an opportunity to kind of press the pause button on all the other stuff that you might have going on, and just think about what you're doing right now, maybe some of the changes that you want to make, and an opportunity to kind of give you some thinking space. We don't get a lot of thinking space in the business of our day-to-day lives and work. So today's an opportunity to give you that kind of clarity, that space to think. And it's really interesting, because when you look at the way the mind works, when it's cluttered, there's a lot going on, it's really difficult for us to think differently. And sometimes we have to slow down and create some space to do that. So this is an opportunity to do that today. We'll talk about why coaching, why do we use coaching? We'll talk about how to start coaching. We'll talk about two particular models that I've found really useful. One is the gold standard. They call it the GROW model. I'll talk you through the GROW model, and a slight variation of the GROW model that I have used and do still to this day use. And then I want to talk to you about more strategic coaching. So when you're coaching people over the long term, what does that look like? Because the GROW model is really useful for intervention coaching, short change intervention. And then there's a model that I've developed called the GRIP model, which I kind of I've actually stumbled across by accident. I'll talk about that a bit later on. And it's been really useful that I use it with clients, and I've used it unintentionally. I've used it on myself multiple times. So I want to share with you this picture. This is a picture of 21-year-old Justin. And this was I'll share this picture because this was a pivotal year in my life. So I was 21. I was just changing careers for the first time. So I'd been an apprentice in a laboratory for about 4.5 years. And in June 2021, I qualified in being a dental technician, so in the lab I was working at, and realized that I didn't want to do that anymore. And it was a pivotal time because I wasn't enjoying my work. I worked for a really awful manager. He was, when I say awful, he used to throw things. He was He was highly emotionally charged. He would get angry at the slightest thing. It was a really bad environment. I'm surprised I managed to last 4.5 years, but I did. And then that was a big driver for me to change. So I changed roles and I changed into a sales role. And then I worked in sales for a couple of different companies, and then I moved into leadership. And it was the transition to leadership and realizing the differences that were required of me as a performer, as a person in a business, that really shifted. And the first time that shifted was when I was 21, and I changed from being a kind of technical person to being a salesperson, where I had to develop my communication skills and really change the way I thought about myself. And then the second big shift was when I changed from being a salesperson to a sales manager, and leadership was the next big shift I had to make. And I share this picture because it really is, it was such a pivotal time, that kind of 21-year-old shift. And it links to what we'll talk about as we think about coaching. But at 21, if you'd said to me at 21, you will go on to do these different things, to make these decisions, to take on these different areas of responsibility, to change the way you operate and think about yourself, I probably wouldn't have believed you. I wouldn't have believed it was something I was capable of doing. And that's a really important point when we think about coaching, because coaching is really about helping other people see something they can't see for themselves. It's a really really critical and vital component of good coaching. Okay, so you can coach, but excellent coaching or transformational coaching requires this shift. And so let's talk a bit about where, during that shift, what happens when people make these changes. What happened to me when I made that change was, for the first period of time, it was a pretty dark place. I can look back now and laugh, but when I made those first shifts, the first one into sales, it was a lot of hard work. I wasn't clear on what I was doing. I didn't feel as if I was making real progress. It was literally day by day. I had to try and continually build my own resilience and try and figure out, how do I make this work? There was a lot of anxiety, a lot of pressure. And then when I made this shift into leadership, the same, I guess, you call it going through the change curve, the same depression in the change curve happened to me, where I wasn't provided with the level of support for management development. And it probably took me 18 months. I went through 18 months where it was just really, really tough, really difficult. And actually, I did at one point, I was trying to get out of my job, or trying to leave the company. I thought I was not enjoying it so much that I felt like the only option was to get out. And thankfully I didn't. I persevered, I pushed through, I found some alternatives, and I managed to get to where I needed to. But what I really needed was some structure. And I didn't have it in those early stages. I didn't have it when I moved into sales. I didn't have it when I moved into leadership. But as I then went through my career, and I went through different leadership development programs, I worked with different mentors. I was really fortunate enough to work with a one-to-one executive coach who helped me to really prioritize my own growth and development. I developed an appetite for reading. So if you'd asked 21-year-old Justin how many books he read a year, he would have said, "What do you mean a year?" I probably hadn't read a book since I'd left school. So that was like a 4 or 5 year gap. And fast forward to, probably I got to about 25, 26 when I first started to really think about my professional development. And now I try and read a book a month. So I'm at least 12 books a year. And it's not just for the sake of reading. I love reading and researching and understanding how do I sharpen and develop skills. So throughout my leadership career, I've read a lot of books. I've developed through a lot of programs, and I've then started to create my own frameworks, models, and reference points. And this model I've developed for leadership coaching is something that blends both my leadership experience and the role I have as an executive coach, coaching other leaders. And this model, to Eleanor's point, okay, so this is I think this may answer your question, Eleanor. So here's how I think about leadership, and in particular where coaching fits with leadership. So I always think that first and foremost, we should have a plan. We have to know what we're trying to achieve. We have to be able to communicate that plan clearly to our teams and the people working with and for us. Okay. So without being able to clearly articulate where we're going, what are the critical components to us getting to where we're going, and how do people contribute towards that progress, it's really difficult because we're not clear and they're not clear. So a plan is really important. Plan first. Okay. Once the plan's in place, then we have to think about the heart of this model is really thinking about trust and relationships. So building trust with people so that they trust us and we trust them. And it's a two-way street. So there's things we can do to develop trust from people and towards people. So once trust is established, and trust should be revisited regularly, then we start to think about a framework for coaching and coaching as a leader. So the first, you'll see that this is a mnemonic called coach. The first C in coach is contracting. So have a contracting and agreement conversation with everybody in our team to talk about how we'll operate, what standards we'll meet, what behaviors and attitudes are in, what behaviors and attitudes are out, what we will course correct, and how we will hold people accountable. Okay, so that's a strategic conversation with everyone in your business. And if you've got someone that has perhaps a more fixed mindset, this initial conversation is really important because it helps you to address that fixed mindset. Okay, so contracting conversation helps you address the fixed mindset. Once you've contracted, then it's about the next step is objectives and goals. So agreeing with people specifically, what does success in their role look like? And it's not just the results and the outcomes, it's what are the key actions they take on a regular basis to deliver or within their role to meet those outcomes and the goals that they set and you agree. So really useful conversation, and documenting that and then reviewing and refining it and working on it regularly is really, really important because that gives people clarity. Okay, so objectives and goals in place. Then the A is action and observation. I learned this mainly through my sales management career, which was spending time with my sales team in the field, in customer meetings, watching how they operated. So they did the action, I did the observation, and it's really valuable when you get the chance as a leader to just observe your teams, because what happens is you create this. I'm sure you've heard of the concept of the Johari window. Okay, the Johari window concept says that we don't know what we don't know. We have blind spots. So there are things we can't see, but other people can see them. And as a manager and as a coach, being able to see what your teams can't see. And sometimes they literally, I'd have coaching conversation with my team where I'd say, what happened at this point in the meeting? And they'd tell me one thing, and it was completely the opposite of what actually happened because of that complete lack of awareness, the total blind spot. So really important. Action and observation is the next point that's really important. And then from that action and observation, that gives us the window to be able to coach. So what we'll talk about today is this slice here called coach for change. And that's where the real change can happen, but it has to change. People have to change intrinsically, as we kind of know. And then final stage, which we won't cover today, but I just want to kind of complete the circle, is we call it heroes in the making. That's about helping people to see an elevated picture of themselves, an increased area of responsibility. Perhaps it might be a career progression. It might be long-term thinking and expansive thinking around what they can do that is beyond their current capability and even their current thinking. And that, as I say, that's the piece for me. When I look back at 21-year-old Justin, if you'd said to Justin, you could get to this stage in your career in the future, he would have said, I'm sorry, you must be talking about somebody else. And that's because sometimes we need someone else to be able to help us to see what potential lies within us, because we can't see it for ourselves. And it's a really important part. And I think about the mentors that have been in my career throughout the last 30-ish years. And very often it's those mentoring discussions that changed my perception of what I was capable of and helped me to think, okay, well, perhaps I could achieve something more. And then that happens stage by stage by stage. And all of a sudden, before you know it, in 10 years, you're somewhere completely different. In 20, it's almost unrecognizable. 30, you think, God, if you told me I could do this 30 years ago, I would have bitten your hand off and said, get me there as quickly as possible. So it's really interesting how these things change and shape us. But today we're going to talk about coach for change. So a couple of principles around coaching. We can only coach people by pivoting the way that we communicate with them to becoming really question-led, by listening really carefully and creating space so that they can think clearly and they open their mind to different ideas. Now, the reason there's a really interesting reason why coaching is so effective, and there's lots of reasons, but one that always sticks with me is that if you look at the research, what it shows is that the mind operates and the way that the mind operates is to produce thoughts. And it produces, when you measure them, it produces the same thoughts 90% of the time. So 90% of the time, people's mind goes to the same thought that they had earlier in the day, or the day before, or the day before that, or the week before. And coaching is one of the few things that helps people to break that pattern, break the cycle of repetitive thinking. So we have to recognize that can only be done by questioning and listening, by asking the right questions. And when we think about coaching for change, there's this model called the GROW model, which you may have heard of. It's referred to as the gold standard. It was originally developed and kind of written up by a guy called Sir John Whitmore, who was like the founder of the GROW model and the coaching movement. And he wrote a book called Coaching for Performance. And that's where the GROW model was first introduced into kind of modern day coaching culture and business. And the whole idea of coaching is that you park yourself and you think about the other person, whether that's your team member, whether it's a colleague, whether it's, I used to quite enjoy coaching my boss. So whether it's your boss, you park yourself and you only focus on the other person and what they can come up with as answers to the questions that you ask. The other thing about coaching is you have to have rapport. And you have to have a relationship and trust, because if you don't, then people won't open up. They won't feel as comfortable and confident to be vulnerable. They won't feel confident and comfortable to perhaps pause and properly think. Sometimes when I'm coaching, you'll see people will have to stop because you're interrupting the 90% repeat. So you'll ask them a question, they give you the answer, and you go, well, hold on, let's think about it differently. What else could you do? And then they go, and you have to be comfortable to allow that space. And so do they. They only do that if they trust you. We have to slow down, and we talked about space. And the reason we're creating space is because we want people to expand their thinking, think beyond the 90% repetition. That's where we're really trying to get to with coaching. And then, of course, we are questioning and listening, which we said, but we're also challenging. So challenging assumptions through the questions, challenging the way someone is running on default, and maybe even sometimes challenging beliefs, which we'll talk a bit about when we look at the models. And then the other thing that happens with coaching, the more you coach, the more you can start to trust your own intuition and experience to tell you where to go next with the next question or the next iteration with that person. And the other thing about coaching is, because it's so normal for managers to give people direction and say, look, just do this next or just do that next, that it's a bit of a trap. So we end up telling people or directing people. And the idea of coaching is that you don't do that. If you do want to make a suggestion, then we do what we call signposting. And the signposting might be, can I share an idea with you? And the person will normally say yes, especially if they're stuck. You might share an idea, which is like a signpost. Here's an idea about what you could consider, and then go back into coaching mode. So then say, so now that I've shared that idea, what are you thinking? So we're always trying to get the ideas and the commitment and the actions to come from the person we're coaching, because otherwise they may pick up an idea you share with them, but if it's direction and action oriented, they'll do it once, and that tends to be where it stops, and then you find them slipping back into previous behaviors. And so that's kind of coaching. Now, the reason coaching is so effective is because when people think for themselves, there's this phenomenon that happens in the brain called the creation of a neural pathway. So in the brain, we have lots of neurons, and the neurons are the parts of the brain that enable thinking. But as we start to develop ideas and thoughts, they create what we call pathways. The pathways create an unconscious response, so that when we're asked to do something, our mind goes, yeah, I know how to do that. I'll automatically go to do this. And that's positive because it enables us to fast track and work really quickly. If you think about, a good example is like opening a door, right? So you walk up to a door, because you've seen a door before, you know that you grab the handle and you push it down. If there's no handle, you know it's either going to be push or slide. And so all of a sudden, we don't need to say that's a door, this is what you need to do. The brain creates these pathways. And the great thing about coaching is it helps people to create pathways to new behaviors. When we tell people what to do and we give them instruction, the evidence shows that the pathway isn't formed. when someone else is doing the thinking for you, you don't create the pathway. And that's why we have to coach, because coaching helps people to become more self-sufficient, become more autonomous in what they're doing. So that's kind of the framework for coaching. So when we start to coach, we talked about asking questions and listening. And you can do this in all sorts of ways. But what the evidence shows is that actually following a structure can guide people more effectively. And this GROW model is basically a step-by-step structure that guides the coaching conversation. So let's just talk through the GROW model. The G for the GROW model is the goal. So what is it you're trying to achieve? And the reason the goal is first is because most people coming into a conversation with you where you want to have a coaching conversation, they will normally be stuck on a problem. And they'll have ruminated on the problem and they normally approach you with a problem that needs to be solved. And they haven't thought about, actually, what do I want to get as an outcome, rather than how do I overcome the problem, or how do I get unstuck from the problem. So we immediately say, well, what do you want instead? So we immediately change the focus from the problem to the goal. And once they actually, sometimes just articulating the goal will help someone to go, oh yeah, that's actually what I want, right? So moving them to goal is a really important first step. Now, if someone's clarified the goal, then the next step is to say, okay, so where are you now? What's the reality of the situation? And we'll talk about the different types of questions for these. Once you've established the reality, then we start to talk about options. So, okay, so this is where you want to get to. This is where you are now. There's clearly a gap. What are the options open to you to address the gap? Okay. And then the final thing is, because options is an exploratory conversation where they might come up with lots of different ideas. Once you and they have talked about all their ideas, then you say, okay, so you've got all these different options. Now let's talk about what you will do. What's realistic, or what can you get to first, or what should you do next? And that is the GROW model. And it's really, really effective to coach in pretty much any situation. And so let's talk about some of the types of questions. So what's the goal? What's the ideal outcome? In a high performance context, I've had coaching conversations with people where there might not be something specific they want to talk about. So I'll say, well, let's talk about your role in the business, and let's talk to me about what high performance means to you, especially if you've got someone that's kind of in the middle range or in that lower third, and they're not quite firing on all cylinders. Start to have this conversation about not what they're doing today. What does high performance look like in your role? And it's interesting because, again, to your point, Eleni, you've got someone that's got a fixed mindset. I've gone into businesses where, working for the business where I've gone in as a manager, and I've got people who have kind of said, well, I don't know who this guy is coming in. I've been in this business 10, 15 years. Who are you to teach me? You're the new guy. And that's when coaching's even more important, right? Because you can't teach them what they already know. So what I've then said to people who say, well, I've been here a long time, I've got a lot of experience, I'll say, so would you describe yourself as being the best in the world at what you do? And then humility kicks in. So I was like, well, no, I wouldn't say I was the best in the world. And there's the framework for coaching. So, okay, so if you were the best in the world, if you were like the best in the world at doing this, and think about it, world class, what would that look like? And you're at goal. Okay, so what would that look like? So once you get to someone to thinking more expansively, okay, so I've got to stop thinking of the stuff I do day to day, think differently, think of an ambitious goal. So we get the goal identified as the first step. Then we might say, okay, so if that's what world class looks like, or if that's the ideal outcome that you're aiming for, where are you now? And what have you tried so far? What's working for you, or what's worked? What hasn't worked for you? What haven't you tried that you could have tried? So we're really starting to get to where are you, and calibration of, okay, there is a gap between what I want and where I am today. And once we've got goal and reality, then we can start to talk about options. And it could be as simple as, okay, so what are your options, or what are the options? You might say, what could you be doing differently? You might say, what would you do if you were guaranteed to succeed? What would you do if you had unlimited budget? What would a high performer, or what would best in the world be doing, do you think? So you can start to tease out some of these answers that get people to think differently about the option stage. And actually, the options part of coaching is probably the most enjoyable part, because it really does help to get people thinking more freely, openly, and come up with some ideas that normally are quite unique to that person. And then final stage of the grow model is the will. So, okay, so we've talked about some great ideas. You've come up with some really useful concepts. You've identified some people that you could emulate. Now, what will you do? Okay, what's the next step? And normally they'll tell you. You might say, okay, when are you thinking? When will you do that? You might need, depending on the person, you might need to get a bit of leverage. Okay, what do you need to do to fully commit to this if you're sensing that they're not fully engaged? And then something I've done with my teams, because I don't want to say, I don't want to be micromanaging, but I will say, so how will I know when you've done it? And normally that will be them saying, well, I should check back in with you, or I'll let you know by this date. And that creates that final sense of accountability. And then depending on the situation, how will it feel when you succeed? So the final question really links to something that they can sense a bit of positive momentum, and they can reflect on, actually, this is the good feeling I'm going to get having done, having completed whatever it is that you're coaching them on. And that's pretty successful. That's been a successful model within the Grow model. What I tend to do is add a final stage. So that final stage is I've named it kind of sustain. So really what we want to do when we're coaching is help people to think beyond just fixing that problem that they're presenting with, and get them thinking, okay, well, this is probably not an isolated incident. This is something that potentially I'm going to be encountering in the future. So how will you look at this again, or how will you do this again? How will you succeed in this situation again in future, as you start to think about the improvements you make through this conversation? You might say, once you've got this in place, how will you sustain the progress? How will you measure the progress? You might say, what will you do to start to become more self-sufficient in the future as well? And without these final questions, what I've noticed is coaching is really effective, but without this final sustain and almost building momentum, without these questions, you tend to find you're coaching on similar topics over and over again. So actually getting people to think about this final stage is really useful, because they get beyond their 90%, this 90% of recurring thinking and problem solving. So that's the Grow model, and it's really, really effective. I'll share the slides with you after today's session as well. But one of the things that I noticed as I went through my career and worked with managers and leaders and had, as I say, my own coaches, was, I don't know if you've heard of David Goggins. He's a bit extreme at times, but this is his quote a lot. I kind of like this quote. He says, you have to be willing to go to war with yourself and create a whole new identity. I don't know if you need to go to war, but you certainly need to be able to create a whole new identity. And it's really useful if you can help people to start to think about their own identities as well. And I went on to ChatGPT this morning as I was preparing for today's session on this model. And I dropped into ChatGPT some different images of me, and I said, I'd be really interested to see your images around changing my identity. I talked about the 5 different roles. That was the first image it came up with, which I thought was quite useful. So this was me as a technician, this was me as a salesperson, sales manager, business leader, and then I fed it this picture of me in a Hugo Boss t-shirt. Anyway, so that was the first image. I thought that was quite good, but it doesn't look a lot like me. So I said, can you make it look a bit more like me? Then it made it a cartoon. I don't know why I did that, so I just thought I'd share this for a bit of fun. Then I said, can you look at it again? And perhaps could you ask, I gave it a picture of me with one of my books. So then it put this picture here. I said, it still doesn't look very much like me. Can you try it again? Did that. Still didn't really look a lot like me. And then the final one I gave up after this. I thought it was getting a bit closer, but still not quite. I don't know. You could be the judge. Sometimes it's difficult to tell for yourself, isn't it? That's where we ended up with ChatGPT's images today. Anyway, I thought it was quite funny. So let's talk about identity change. So similar to the Grow model, I've got this model, which is the GRIP model. And GRIP is really kind of thinking about identity change rather than just individual coaching. So the G is still goal, the R is still reality, but the I becomes identity, and the P becomes plan. So we then end up with a series of coaching questions that start with, what are you aiming to achieve? what is the very best outcome? What does true success look like for you? And that could be within your career, could be, you know, in the next 10 years, it could be thinking out towards the end of your career. What would true success look like? And just start and actually start to get people to think bigger and more strategically. Then, of course, the reality questions are similar. Where are you now? What have you tried? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What haven't you tried? You might even say, what do you really love doing? What don't you like doing? Because that helps people with career direction. And then the identity questions are quite interesting because they are more about the person. So who do you need to become? And starting to think that through, because in each of my career changes, I hadn't really thought it through until I got in the role, and then felt a little bit like an imposter, started to feel a bit almost like I undermined myself just from the way that I was thinking about it. And actually, if someone had sat me down and started to, you know, talk me through, question me through, okay, how do you need to change how you think about yourself? Who do you need to become that's different in order to take this next step? And what beliefs will you have to overcome? It's really important that, because we form beliefs without realizing we form them. What personal changes do you need to make in yourself? How do you need to see yourself differently as you transition into this, you know, area of greater responsibility or area of different specialty, or what skills might you need to start to think about developing? But really linking this to identity and how that person perceives themselves, because when someone starts to change the way they think about themselves, actually everything else then seems to flow much more easily for them. And I've noticed that for myself. And sometimes that behavior change it's not easy to do without some coaching, because you tend to find yourself a bit stuck because of the 90% rule. And then finally, you know, the plan. Okay, so if you know where you want to get to, you know where you are now, you know you need to make some changes in how you think about yourself. Okay, what are you going to do about that? What key actions do you need to take? What timescales do you need to work on it? What are some of the challenges you'll face, and how do you address those challenges? How often do you need to discuss this to get the right progress and support to move forward? So really thinking about, you know, an action plan as the final step that lays out the different stages and steps that people need to take. Because when we're talking about changing identity and the way that we perceive ourselves, that doesn't happen in a single conversation. That happens in a structured series of different conversations that you have over time. And I can think about multiple people that I managed as a sales manager and as a business manager, where I saw real potential in them. And one person in particular, who was a guy who was a salesperson working for me, and he was absolutely brilliant. He was the highest performing salesperson in my team. He was really a lot of humility, quite self-effacing. When I first started working with him, he just couldn't see his own potential. And I had identity conversations with him, because I could recognize in him what I'd recognized earlier in myself in my career. And he ended up making, actually really interesting. He ended up moving into marketing, getting a marketing degree, then becoming a sales manager, then becoming the national sales manager. And then I now work with him as a client, and he is the country manager for the business that he runs. And every time I talk to him, he says same thing. He said, I'd never have even thought I could do this, Justin. It was those conversations that we had early in my career that really triggered it all. And it's sometimes you need someone else to just help you see this change that's possible, because you can't always see it for yourself. And I always think as leaders, it's the biggest gift we have to give people that work for us, is that opportunity for them to see a different potential for themselves and start to act in line with that greater potential for themselves. Really, really useful. Okay, I've been talking for long enough. It feels like. I'm going to pause now and just give you a chance to socialize some of the stuff that we've talked about in the session. Just an opportunity to give you some feedback, ask some questions, share your insights and actions from the session so far. I've got a couple more slides I'm going to share with you as we wrap up at the end. But before we do that, let's just pause and give you a chance to share some feedback. Who'd like to share something that you're taking away?
I'm going to try it, Justin. I've done the grow model before, but I can see the value in the identity bit that you've added in there, because that's critical, really, isn't it, when you think about it?
Yeah. Well, you're a good example of this as well, Joe, aren't you? With your taking on your role in developing the CIC and the charity. That's a completely different.
Well,
You
yes.
are a completely
Oh,
different
yeah,
person
it's
having done that, aren't you?
totally. Well, no, this is why I understand the identity bit, because I'm still in the process of doing that, becoming the person I need to be to run a successful social enterprise with a
Yeah.
background as a dental nurse. You know, it's fabulous, and you know, you're really like your best salesman. You know, you're kind of key in helping me, you know, achieve what I want to achieve, Justin. Because, like you said, it's about moving forward and realizing, actually, you know, they always say to step out of your comfort zone. When you start off, you're not going to have all the skills you need right now, but you're going to develop them on that path. So that's the road I'm on. But because of that, then the identity bit is how I understand how important that is, which is out of the grow model. Because, like you said, if you know, if you say, oh, what actions would I need to take, A, B, and C? But if you don't actually believe in your head that you've got the ability to successfully achieve those actions, then you've almost failed before you've even moved away from the conversation, haven't you?
Yeah.
So I think I like it. Grip. Get a grip of yourself, Justin.
Get a grip.
I'll try and get a grip of myself. And I think I try and do that with my volunteers as well. Try and, you know, encourage them and say, actually, you know, how are you feeling about this? I believe in you. I think you could, you know, take a step further, and yeah, no, thanks. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on continuing on my identity, because there's still a lot of improvement that needs to happen there, Justin. But yeah, look at each of my volunteers and say, right, okay, where do you think, you know, your scope is, and actually build them up a bit about that. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Pleasure. Thanks, Joe. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad I like your insights as well. Excellent. Thank you. Eleanor.
Oh, perfect. I would agree. The identity part, what really resonated with me actually is talking about almost imposter syndrome. And you start thinking, is this really for me? Am I doing the right thing? And I have always been really over concerned with, do the people I'm coaching think I'm micromanaging them? Is that the way it's coming across? And I would, well, I think that I am very, in a way, I would say to them, well, what do you think you should do? And what would happen if you did that? And what about if you almost play devil's advocate a bit and say, okay, you could do that, but what if this happened? And I don't know if it comes across that I can maybe be not controversial, contrary. That's the word that they think, oh, why are you arguing with me? But it's really trying to get people to see or look at it in a different way. But I work with, for example, a practice manager, and I coach her, and she is one of these managers, and I've seen them over the years, and they will just say, go and do this because I told you. And I say, but if you explain why, you don't need to tell people again. So I think it's almost like the reinforcement that the coaching does work, and it's not just my boss. In fact, he's very much just tell them what to do. But I believe you have to give everybody that knowledge so that they can think for themselves.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting, isn't it? Because being direct, the problem is being directive and telling people what to do does work, right? It does work, but it works short term. So you end up continually doing it, but it works. And until you recognize that you want people to start to think for themselves, and you want to free yourself up from that burden of having to continually direct and tell people what to do, until that light bulb comes on for you, or actually there's a better way for me to do this, actually you stick with what works, because your brain's going 90% of the time, this works. So I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Joe said in the chat about the perfect team structure, we're all trying to free up our own time a little bit. So if people can think and be able to resolve issues without coming to you constantly for a solution, I think it would be very beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, totally agree. And I, it's the thing is, it's like I think it's like a phased transition you have to make, because you have to take those people have to come on the journey to want to start to develop and be responsible and think for themselves. And in early conversations, if they're used to just being told what to do, that's a shift they have to make. And so you have to take people on a journey. But also as a manager, if your default style has been to direct and give people that, clear sense of, this is what you do, this is when you do it, then it's a shift for you to make as well. So there's two adjustments. You've got to adjust, they've got to adjust, and that takes a bit of time. And when you start coaching, this is what I learned, when you start coaching, it feels like you're going the long way round, because you're like, I could just tell them how to do this, right? It feels like, why am I going the long way round? Why am I asking them, what do they want to achieve? Where are they now? What are their options? Okay, what are you going to do? So I'm asking 4 questions when I could say to you, just do this. So it feels like it's taking 4 times as long. Yeah. And in the short term, that's absolutely true. But when you get a year out, 2 years out, 3 years out, and you don't ever have to ask those 4 questions, because people are now thinking for themselves, and you're only ever asking them those 4 questions when they meet something really big and challenging, and actually most of the rest of the time, their 90% default is to think for themselves, you've completely transformed the way that everybody operates. And but that's the leap that we have to take as managers in our minds around how we make that transformation for other people. So it's a long way around in the short term, but it's the fast track to long-term success.
Totally. I completely agree, Justin. And that, going back to that, is there a perfect team structure? Really, it's less about the structure, more about how well trained your team are.
Yeah.
So say, for example, if I've got 4 managers and then they're all coaching their teams, then I've got all the time in the world, haven't I? Marvelous.
Yeah. And I see your question there, Joe. If we get patients to come up with the idea of flossing daily for themselves, it will develop a brain pathway. They're more likely to start flossing. Yeah. And
we'll try a bit of coaching tomorrow in surgery, and we'll see.
Yeah. I don't know if have you read Atomic Habits by James Clear?
Yes. Well, of course, I've listened to it, Justin. It's only
okay. So he specifically talks about flossing, doesn't he?
Yeah. It's good. It's good. I like it. I signed up to his emails, and I never have time to read any of them. His 321 emails. I'm sure they're really good.
The one thing that always sticks with me from his book, and it was kind of linked to coaching, was that environment dictates performance, right? So if stuff's really easy to do because the environment's set up for it, we'll do it. So what he does is he keeps his floss in a pot with his toothbrush. So it's there. He doesn't have to go scrambling for it, doesn't have to look for it. And that simple change in his environment has meant he does it every day. Whereas before, when he didn't know where the floss was, or it was someone else. And so it's those small tips that people can pick up and use, where you say, where could you keep it on a daily basis so that you saw it every time, and it made it really easy to do. So it's like it's the thinking about it, but it's also setting up their environment to make it easy and practical for them to follow through. Nice, thank you. Great conversation. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Eleanor. Right, let me share a couple of other things, and then we will wrap up, and I'll let you finish your day. You will have seen this before, Joe, with me, but it's worth the reminder. So I love this quote, or this research actually, by Clifton Anderson, which kind of links to the 90% of recurring thoughts, right? So it's believed that the average person uses no more than 10% of his or her potential. 10%. We're not even scratching the surface of what we are capable of. We are all blessed with a continent of unexplored gifts and talents, and we need to use them or lose them. And I totally think that's such a good fit with coaching and what we're able to do with people when we're helping and coaching them. One of the things that I've learned throughout my leadership career was, in order to be successful, you need 5 pillars. The first pillar is confidentiality. You need to be able to have conversations with people that won't go any further. That's so that you can really declare what's most important for you and share your vulnerabilities. You need to be part of a community, so a group of people that are going through the same things, that understand where you are, so you don't have to keep explaining it from the start again. You need to be able to collaborate with people that are able to share ideas, able to pick up your ideas, so that you're sharing stuff that is valuable. They're sharing things with you are valuable. And actually that sense of mutual collaboration is really positive for you as a leader and positive for the people around you. We need to have an environment where we feel safe to be challenged, so that our ideas are challenged, the way that we operate is challenged, so we break the 90%, recurrence. And then the final thing is we need an environment where we feel a sense of commitment to change, a commitment to do something different and follow through on what it is we know is most important. And I run a Coaching Leaders Academy, which is a 12-month program, and we basically set the whole program up based on the models you've seen, based on the book that I wrote, and on these 5 key elements of leadership success. So if that sounds of interest to you, then feel free to let me know. And then the final thing I wanted to offer you is a free discovery session. If you are interested, I'm just putting it in the chat. And I'll also put it on the email follow-up from today. But if you're interested in a one-to-one strategy session or discovery session to talk about your business, what you're doing, and maybe if you want some more ideas on either how I might be able to help or how we might be able to work together, then very happy to set something up. That will take you straight into my diary. You'll get access to my calendar, and you can schedule something. It's be like a Zoom call where we can talk in a bit more kind of from a one-to-one perspective about what's most important for you and your business. Okay. We are at 10 to the hour. It's good timing. So we've got, I normally aim to finish about 5 to, so you've got some time for finishing up, ready for your 2 o'clock. Most people have a 2 o'clock. But before we finish, just a final kind of opportunity for questions or anything else that you want to discuss. You actually can ask anything you want if you're feeling that way inclined. Any final? Go on, Joe. I knew you'd have a question. Brilliant.
Well, there's not a question. Well, there's a couple of things. I listened to that book that you recommended last time, The Ideal Team Player. Oh,
yeah. What did you think?
Oh, it's total rubbish. Total waste of my life, Justin. No, I'm just joking. It was really good. I listened to it 3 times.
Have you listened to Coaching for Performance by John Whitmore yet?
No, I've just downloaded it. So I'll let you know.
Thanks
for that.
That's all right. I think you'll enjoy it. Have you read Coaching Leaders yet, Joe?
I'm not sure. Coaching Leaders. Is that yours? Oh, God. No, because you haven't got an audio book, Justin. I keep telling you, when are you going to record the audio?
How very dare you, Joe? How very dare you? Joe, have you heard? Did we talk about Speechify?
Yeah, I think I did try that before with your other book. But you know, I'm not very technical, although now I've got a new web developer who's just joined our team to help rebuild the website. But actually, he's decided off his own bat, because I need such support, he's going to create an IT support team for me.
Is he? Brilliant.
So he can help me.
So Speechify is the app where you put any PDF into it and it will read it, and you can choose the voices. You can have Gwyneth Paltrow, you can have Mr. Beast, really? All sorts of, yeah, honestly, it's awesome. So you can
How do you spell Speechify?
Speechify, speech, as in
SPEE.
Yeah, it's the H.
CHIFY.
You got it, yeah, Speechify. And it's I've had a few people that have picked it up, and one guy in particular emailed me and said, "I love listening to Gwyneth Paltrow read your book." I thought, what a brilliant piece of feedback. Who'd have thought that, Gwyneth Paltrow reading my book? It feels like I've arrived.
So funny. Right, okay. I'll maybe look into it. Amazing.
Have a look. Brilliant. Any other questions before we wrap?
I've got a little one. Has anybody got anything else to say, or shall I just talk again?
Go on, Joe.
Quick question for you, Justin. What do you get hanging off banana trees?
Bananas, right?
Sore arms.
Oh dear. I'll take it, Joe. I'll take it. If I had younger children, I'd tell them that joke tonight. But mine are grown up, and they would just look at me as if looking like.
As if you're as mad as me, I know.
Yeah, as if I was as mad as Joe.
Have a lovely weekend. Thanks, Justin. That was amazing.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Eleanor. Nice to see you, Dorcas. Take care.
I'll let you know
weekend, everybody. See you soon.
Bye.
Yeah. Thanks. See you later. Bye.
Bye.